All right, so here we are, the final video of the guts of the Epiphone EA14 RVT, the Epiphone Ensign. A couple of general things. I wasn't looking to maintain any kind of vintage integrity through the amp. I wanted a good sounding amp. These are not known for sounding good out of the box, but a unique sounding amp nevertheless. I wanted it 100% fully functioning. I wanted to use or reuse as many of the original components as possible, including tubes. Not really worried about drilling holes in the amp itself. I wasn't looking for full integrity of the amp. And obviously, I wanted to maximize safety in the amp also. So let's go over some of the things that were done. First, I redid the entire power section. A couple of things. At house voltage, what ended up happening with all the new caps, and by the way, these power resistors are to the schematic. They are slightly different than were originally in this amp, which is fine. The voltages all come out correctly or workable, very workable throughout the amp. But with house power and this transformer, getting some too brutal voltages for the tubes. We're talking about 485, pushing 490 volts on the plates and the screens. A little too much for the screens, worried about that. And as you can see here, I decided to go ahead and use it through a bucking transformer. This amp is never going to leave the house. So although it's wired so that it can be plugged into the wall, I'm going to use it through here. One thing about this bucking transformer is it's one of two I have. The other one isn't here. A friend has it for one of their amps that I set up for him. This one goes down to 108 volts. Arguably, it's a little too low for this amp. I mean, all the voltages work, but it could probably run at 115 pretty well, as opposed to house voltage. But this is fine. With that, at 108 volts through the bucking transformer, I'm getting about 435, 440 on the plates and screens, which is great. I'm fine with that. The schematic says it's supposed to be pushing 460, but even that arguably is out of the max design range for typical 6L6 GCs, or what's in here, which are 7581s. Particularly on the screen, which are, I think they say 450 max. I know that can be pushed, but nevertheless, the bias range, what ends up happening with the changes that I made to the bias, changing this dropping resistor to ground to accommodate originally what would have been house voltage, I've got to run it pretty much all the way down to the coolest setting. Now at 435, 430 volts, on the plates, it's at its hottest setting. We're getting about 15, 16 watts through the cathode resistor, which means the plates are probably pushing 14 or so. Figure the screens are taking a couple of watts each. That's okay. It sounds great, by the way. Just overall, it sounds great. The star grounding system that which I've got the power supply and the bias and the center taps are at a single point. The jumping ahead to the preamp sections, which include these, which do include these two, which is the B and C node, they go all the way down and ground here. The power tubes, which was a little worried about their proximity to the output transformer, which is here, I ran them separately to a point here. So we've got the main power and bias output tubes, and I've got another separate node for, actually this is for the B and C node, that's right. Over here, it works. It's quiet. The amp is quiet. There's no ground loops, and that's all good. Another thing, going back to this power resistor, this thing does get pretty hot. It's probably dropping about close to 5 watts, and that's what it would have been even in the original design, which would be a 4K resistor. This is a 10 watt resistor. I've moved these caps as far away as possible to accommodate for that, and everything seems to be fine. So just moving forward through the power, because I removed T-filters, I freed up some space and was able to put the last two power caps of 6, 320s and 310s onto the board, and it works very well. So there you go. One of them supplies, I believe, the trem circuit, and the other one supplies the phase inverter. I was debating where that would ground, but it seems to all work out. The other thing I did in the power, I don't know if it's possible to see, this fuse is actually, you would think that there is a high tension fuse and a mains fuse here. Actually, it's not. There's only a mains fuse. This other fuse, which would have been a 3 amp fuse, was actually for the auxiliary, which is now detached. So this fuse is not in play at all. So just the 2 amp mains is involved. And let's see if I can lean here and go zoom in a little bit. If you look, yeah, to the switch, power switch, standby and power, what I did end up doing is putting a cap across the standby because it was popping quite loudly when engaging power. It pops a little bit now, but it is better. So that's another thing that I did reinstall from originally looking to taking that out. That was my original goal, was to take it out. What else did I do here? So the tone stacks, back to those. Originally, I had gone to the Duncan tone stack calculator and tried to dial in what would be 2 different tone stack profiles. I wanted the one without the reverb to be flatter, perhaps, more like a British kind of flat kind of thing. Dare I say Marshall-esque. It's not wired like a Marshall, but the profile I dialed in on the Duncan stack calculator, tone stack calculator, was such. When I tried to dial it in, one of the things was all of these pots, the treble and the bass pot, there is no mid pot on either channel, are both 1 meg. If you look at a Fender type of circuit, they're 250K. So there was some dialing in, and what I thought I had dialed in on what ends up being channel 2, which is what I was going for, more of a mid-scoop Fender type of thing, didn't really, it was it was a little too boomy in the bottom. I thought it was okay at first, but there was too much bottom. And an odd thing was, and I should have realized this, when I dialed it in, a 100, here's the tone stack for this end, a 100 picofarad treble cap is what kind of dialed in, and I should have realized that was not going to supply enough range at the top to do anything other than give sizzle. And so there was a mid scoop, the large bass, and just a sizzle on the top. So I rewired that. I brought up the mid by moving this resistor, which is the resistor which is in place of the mid pot, which goes to ground at the bottom of the bass potentiometer, and bump that up. I believe I moved that up to 8.2K. So if it was a 250K pot on the treble, if this was exactly a Fender type of circuit, which is not quite, this would be sort of putting your mid pot at 8. But because of the interaction, it's still a little more scooped than 8, but it sounds very good. And I replaced this treble cap with a 250 picofarad, which is actually what they do in a lot of Fenders. And that really kind of brought the range between the treble into the mid-range a little bit more. It's a lot more punch to the amp, and it's not as boomy. So that was one of the things I did with the tone stack. What I've got now is, because of the tones, the slope resistor on this is higher on this channel than it is on this channel. There was more gain on this channel. I think that has a lot to do with it. A lot of the the frequencies that are going to drive to break up are louder here than they are here. Another thing that I did was the trim circuit was the LDR was crapped out. I actually have a separate video on that. I don't know if I don't think I posted it. So this is a fender roach that I replaced. Replaced the bad roach. So now that's all working, and that's all good. And what we have here now is I originally removed the socket for the Gibson type of special switch, the one that has, I think it's a 5 DIN, kind of like a five terminal kind of foot switch that controls both treble and reverb. I originally removed it, and that was stupid because I wasn't going to be able to replace that hole easily without putting another piece of aluminum or steel or something in there and then mounting. What I ended up doing is drilling a hole and mounting a stereo jack here. This stereo jack is grounded to the same bus as the rest of the circuit in the preamp, and now I've got a switch for the trem and the reverb. And just like a lot of amps, the reverb, when the foot switch is not plugged in, the reverb is active, but the tremolo is not. You have to have the foot switch in, which is fine. So that turned out okay. I kicked myself because I had to remount it, and this was riveted, and yeah, I regret doing that, but what can you do? Let's see. So with that, I was able to, I tried to fix the reverb tank. One side was open. I was actually able to get to the wires on the transducer, but I could not get any continuity through it. I had an old Hammond tank that worked perfectly with this. And I came out of an old Hammond console organ, an L110, I think it was. A great little organ, but it is now in pieces. It's an amp now. Okay, so a couple other things are, I've got, let's see if I can turn this around and show the cabinet. Here is the cabinet. Let's see, can I bring this down? Oh well, no. So let's zoom back out. Here is the cabinet. It's actually in pretty good shape. It's a great design. I love the kind of Greek, which makes sense, sort of feel for the lettering. The screen is in very good shape. And if you look here, the Hammond reverb tank is in. So now I've got to mount the speakers. The big deal with these speakers is that one I think is original and one is a replacement. They test okay. One is an Eminence, looks like an Eminence, it's a blue Alnico, which is a great speaker. Little low wattage. I'm assuming it's got the paper coil, which means maybe it's getting 35 watts, which should be okay in the amp. I think the CTS, what is original, I think it's a higher, it's at least 25, if not 35, maybe 40. Thing is, there were some issues with it. Had to re-glue the outside. There's a little puncture. It's that's a famous puncture from when mounting the speaker. Someone poked through one of the screws. There's no rub. It tests okay. And this the Alnico. It's got a little bit, I don't know if you can see it, it's got some little bit of stress here and there, but it's pretty much intact. So those are going to go in, and I'm going to put it all together, and I think that covers pretty much the main stuff that I did with it. I mean, in general, I had to undo a lot of bad decisions, shoddy work with the amp itself. If you look at the original pictures, there's some scary stuff that was done. Redid the screen resistors. I love those resistors. When they can fit, they're great. They're 700 volt resistors. That's these two here. Screen resistors. The grid stoppers are on the board, but it seems to be okay. Everything seems to be functioning. There's the 082 tube in here, which is a cold cathode voltage regulator. When this tube gets going, it makes some really cool, not focusing, really cool glow, and it actually glows with the pulse of the tremolo, so that's kind of cool. Like I said, this thing's never going to leave the house, so it's going to run on the bucking transformer. One day, if I build another transformer or get the other one back that's running more closer to 115 volts, I'll have to rebias it, but the range of the bias that should be able to work right about in the middle. So next thing I'm going to do is put it all back together, and I'll probably do a sound check video. You get to hear my mellifluous guitar playing. How lovely.